The sea surrounding was unnaturally calm that night. It was nearly 9 p.m. when Daniel Carter, a 32-year-old travel photographer and YouTuber, arrived on the remote island. His channel was famous for exploring abandoned places and haunted locations across America. For years, he had heard the same terrifying rumor. Visitors were always ordered to leave the island before sunset, because strange whispers echoed through the old fort after dark. Daniel laughed at the stories. He believed every legend had a logical explanation. So, after the last ferry departed, he secretly stayed behind. He carried only a backpack, a flashlight, his camera, and a small tent. Around 10 p.m., he entered the abandoned fort. The massive brick walls, endless corridors, and salty ocean air created an eerie silence. Then, a faint whisper floated through the darkness. "Don't leave." Daniel spun around. No one was there. He assumed it was the wind. A few moments later, another whisper came from somewhere deeper inside the fort. "Stay with us." This time, it sounded as if dozens of voices were speaking at once. He raised his flashlight and slowly scanned the hallway. At the far end stood a figure dressed in white. The instant Daniel lifted his camera, the figure disappeared. He rushed toward the hallway. No one, only a trail of wet footprints. His heartbeat stopped for a second. The footprints didn't lead in from the ocean. They seemed to emerge directly from the stone wall itself. By 11 p.m., the entire island became unnaturally silent. No wind, no insects, no waves. Then Daniel noticed something floating on the dark sea. An old wooden boat. No lights, no engine, no sound. Yet it drifted slowly toward the island. He zoomed in with his camera. Inside sat at least 10 people. Every one of them had their heads lowered, perfectly still. As the boat reached the shoreline, every passenger slowly lifted their head. Daniel froze. None of them had faces, only smooth skin where their eyes and mouths should have been. Terrified, he stepped backward. A cold breath brushed against his ear. Someone whispered only inches away, "Now, you belong here." He turned instantly. The white figure was standing right behind him, and from every corner of the fort, more shadowy figures slowly emerged from the darkness. Daniel ran without looking back. His footsteps echoed through the endless stone corridors while the whispers followed him everywhere. Oddly, he couldn't hear anyone chasing him, but he knew they were close. After several minutes, he found an abandoned room and slammed the heavy wooden door shut. Breathing heavily, he searched the room with his flashlight. Dust covered everything. In one corner sat an old wooden chest. Inside were several decaying military journals. Most of the pages had rotted away, but a few entries remained readable. One journal read, "September 1898. Soldiers have begun hearing whispers after sunset. Anyone who follows the voices never returns." Another page contained a warning. "If a boat appears from the sea at night, never look at its passengers. Those who do will never see another sunrise." Daniel's hands began shaking. Then, 3 slow knocks echoed through the door. He held his breath. Silence. Then the knocking returned. A calm, male voice spoke. "Daniel." His blood ran cold. How did someone know his name? The voice continued. "Open the door. I'm with the Coast Guard. We're here to rescue you." Daniel frowned. No rescue boat was scheduled until morning. Carefully, he looked through a crack in the door. A Coast Guard officer stood outside. But something was horribly wrong. The man had no legs below his knees. He wasn't standing. He was floating. Daniel stumbled backward. Suddenly, the room became freezing cold. His breath turned white. The flashlight flickered violently. Then, a little girl appeared in the opposite corner of the room. She couldn't have been older than 8. Her clothes were soaked with seawater. Water dripped steadily from her long black hair. She slowly raised her head. Her eyes were completely black. No whites, no pupils, Only darkness. Softly she whispered, "They're still hungry." Then she pointed toward the floor. Daniel lowered his flashlight. The stone floor was covered with water. Not seawater. Wet footprints. Hundreds of them. They surrounded him from every direction. Outside, countless voices began whispering together. "Stay, stay, stay." Dark shadows slowly seeped through the cracks in the walls. Daniel realized he was never alone on the island. Daniel tightened his grip on the flashlight as the whispers grew louder. "Stay with us." The shadows crept closer. The little girl looked at him one last time. "They don't want to kill you," she whispered. "They only want you to stay here. Forever." The moment she disappeared, the entire fort shook violently. It felt as though something enormous was moving beneath the island. Daniel sprinted toward the shoreline. There, tied to a weathered dock, was an old motorboat, his only chance. He untied the rope and climbed aboard. Then he noticed something terrifying. Hundreds of wet footprints covered the sand. Every single one led from the ocean onto the island. None led back toward the sea. He turned the ignition. Nothing. Again, nothing. A third time. Silence. Then he felt someone standing behind him. Slowly. He turned around. The white figure stood only a few feet away. Its face was completely smooth. No eyes, no nose, no mouth. Behind it stood dozens, then hundreds, of identical faceless figures. They all raised one hand toward him. Daniel stepped backward and fell into the freezing ocean. As he sank beneath the surface, he looked down. An entire forgotten town rested beneath the water. Collapsed buildings, broken streets, thousands of motionless people. Then, every one of them opened their eyes. They reached toward him. Daniel fought desperately and finally broke the surface, but the island was gone. Only thick fog surrounded him. The boat had vanished. He floated alone in total darkness. Then, through the mist, the same old wooden boat slowly approached. The faceless passengers lifted their heads together. A chorus of whispers filled the night. "Welcome home." Everything went black. 3 days later, the Coast Guard recovered Daniel Carter's floating camera. The footage was normal until exactly 2:17 a.m. Then the screen filled with dense white fog. A few seconds later, Daniel's face suddenly appeared inches from the camera. His eyes were completely black. He stared directly into the lens and whispered, "Don't stay after sunset." The recording ended immediately. Daniel Carter was never found. Even today, fishermen claim that on quiet nights near dry Tortugas, whispers drift across the water. And anyone who answers those whispers is never seen again. The first thing Ethan Brooks noticed about the island was the silence. Not the peaceful kind of silence, the kind that felt like the world had stopped breathing. The ferry moved slowly across the cold waters of Lake Superior, leaving a long trail of white foam behind it. Thick clouds covered the sky, and the endless gray waves stretched in every direction. Far ahead, surrounded by forest and rocky cliffs, appeared the dark shape of a remote island far away from the noise of civilization, a place where nature ruled, and according to local legends, a place where some things were never meant to be found. Ethan Brooks adjusted his camera and looked through the viewfinder. For the past 5 years, Ethan had traveled across America creating documentaries about abandoned places, old mining towns, forgotten buildings, historical locations with strange stories. But his newest project was different. He wanted to explore an abandoned lighthouse that had been closed for decades, the Gray Harbor Lighthouse. Built in the early 1900s, the lighthouse once guided ships through the dangerous waters of Lake Superior. But after a mysterious incident in 1912, it was permanently abandoned. Official records blamed a storm. Local people blamed something else. They said the lighthouse keeper disappeared after claiming the light was turning on by itself. They said he kept repeating one sentence before he vanished. The light isn't showing ships the way home. It's showing them where to go. Ethan didn't believe ghost stories. To him, every legend had a forgotten truth buried underneath. A mistake, an accident, a misunderstanding. That was what he planned to discover. As the ferry approached the island dock, an old man standing near the front of the boat looked at Ethan's equipment. "You filming the lighthouse?" Ethan turned. The man was probably in his 70s, with a weathered face and gray beard. "Yes," Ethan replied. The old man stared at him for a few seconds. Then his expression changed. "Why?" Ethan smiled. "It's just a documentary." The old man looked toward the dark forest behind the shoreline. "People don't go there anymore." "Why?" The man lowered his voice. "Because the lighthouse still works." Ethan laughed softly. "The power was disconnected years ago." The old man didn't smile. "I didn't say the electricity works." The ferry became quiet. Ethan noticed several passengers looking away. Nobody seemed interested in continuing the conversation. Before leaving, the old man grabbed Ethan's arm. "If the light turns on after midnight, don't look at it." Ethan frowned. "What happens if I do?" The old man released his arm. "You'll see something that sees you back." Then he walked away. By afternoon, Ethan reached the lighthouse. It stood alone on a rocky cliff overlooking the lake. The building was taller than he expected. The white paint had faded. The windows were covered in dust. The metal staircase outside was covered with rust. But despite being abandoned for decades, the lighthouse looked strangely preserved, almost like someone was still taking care of it. Ethan entered with his camera recording. Inside, the air smelled of old wood and salt water. The ground floor contained broken furniture, old maps, and dusty journals left behind by previous lighthouse keepers. He searched through the documents. Most were damaged, but one journal caught his attention. It belonged to the final lighthouse keeper, Thomas Reed. The last entry was dated October 14th, 1912. Ethan read the faded handwriting. The light turned on again tonight. There were no ships, no storm, nothing on the lake. The next sentence was darker. But something answered from the island. Ethan stopped reading. A strange feeling moved through him. He turned the page. The rest of the journal had been ripped out. "Convenient," he whispered. As evening approached, the temperature dropped quickly. Ethan set up his equipment and prepared to spend the night. The ferry would return the next morning. He wanted nighttime footage of the lighthouse. That was when the real atmosphere would begin. At 10:30 p.m., rain started hitting the windows. The sound filled the empty building. Ethan sat beside his camera, reviewing the footage from earlier. Everything seemed normal, until he reached a clip recorded inside the lighthouse tower. He paused. There was something strange. At the very top of the stairs, for one single frame, a person appeared, standing completely still, watching him. Ethan replayed it. The figure disappeared. He zoomed in. The image became blurry, but he could clearly see one thing. The person was wearing an old lighthouse keeper's uniform. Ethan stood up. Slowly. "Someone's here." He grabbed his flashlight and climbed toward the tower. The stairs creaked beneath his feet, higher, higher, until he reached the top. The room was empty. Only the giant glass lens stood in the center, covered in dust. Ethan approached it. Then he noticed something impossible. The lens was warm, like it had been turned on recently. He stepped back. At that exact moment, the lighthouse bell rang. Once, deep, powerful, echoing across the empty island. Ethan froze, because the lighthouse had no bell. It had been removed decades ago. Then, a faint beam of light appeared. Slowly, the giant lens began rotating. The abandoned lighthouse was alive again, and the light was not pointing toward the lake. It was pointing directly into the forest. Ethan looked through the window. Deep among the trees, hundreds of small lights appeared, like lanterns, moving slowly, coming closer. Then, his camera picked up a sound behind him. A whisper. A voice from inside the lighthouse. "You finally came back." Ethan slowly turned around, but the room behind him was empty, except for one thing, a wet footprint on the wooden floor, a footprint that was facing him. The wet footprint remained on the wooden floor. Ethan stared at it without moving. His mind searched for a logical explanation. Maybe someone had entered the lighthouse before him. Maybe another researcher was hiding nearby. Maybe the old stories were just exaggerated rumors, but deep inside, he knew none of those explanations made sense. The footprint was fresh. The floor around it was completely dry. Only one wet mark remained, and it was facing him. Ethan slowly raised his flashlight and searched the room. Nothing. The lighthouse lens continued rotating silently. The beam of light moved across the forest outside, revealing nothing but endless trees and darkness. Then the whisper came again, this time from behind him. "You shouldn't have followed the light." Ethan turned quickly. The room was empty. His heart raced. He grabbed his camera and started recording again. "Something is happening inside this lighthouse," he whispered. "The light is turned on by itself, and I just heard someone speaking." He stopped, because as he looked at the camera screen, he noticed something strange. The reflection behind him showed a person standing near the stairs, but when Ethan turned around, nobody was there. He slowly looked back at the camera. The reflection was gone. Ethan decided he needed to leave the tower. He rushed down the spiral staircase. Each step echoed through the empty lighthouse, but halfway down, he heard footsteps above him, slow, heavy, following him. Ethan stopped. The footsteps stopped. He looked upward. The staircase disappeared into darkness. "Hello?" No answer. He continued downward. Again. The footsteps followed, but this time they sounded different. They weren't walking behind him. They were walking beside him, as if someone was moving through the wall. Ethan reached the bottom floor and quickly locked the tower door. He stood there, breathing heavily. Then he noticed something on the old wooden table. A journal, not the one he had found earlier. A new one, covered in fresh water. Ethan slowly opened it. The handwriting was different, newer. The first page contained only one sentence. "If you are reading this, the lighthouse has chosen you." Ethan immediately closed the book, but curiosity forced him to open it again. The next pages described events from decades ago. The final lighthouse keeper, Thomas Reed, had written about strange things happening after midnight. He claimed the lighthouse wasn't built only to guide ships. It was built because something in the waters around the island needed a signal, something that appeared only during certain nights. Thomas wrote, "The first time I saw the lights in the forest, I thought they were people carrying lanterns. Then I realized they were not carrying the lights. The lights were following them." Ethan stopped reading. His hands became cold. He turned another page. "They don't come from the forest. They come through it." Suddenly, the lighthouse door shook. Ethan jumped. Another sound hit the door. Something was outside. He slowly approached the window. The rain had stopped. The fog had become thicker, and standing among the trees were people. Dozens of them, maybe hundreds, all holding small glowing lights. They stood completely still, watching the lighthouse. Ethan lifted his camera. The zoom revealed something terrifying. They weren't tourists, they weren't hikers. Their clothes looked old. Some wore early 1900s clothing. Others wore uniforms from different decades, people from different times, standing together, waiting. Then every person in the forest slowly turned toward Ethan. Even though he was several hundred feet away, he felt like they were looking directly into his eyes. The lights they carried suddenly went out, one by one, until the entire forest became black. Then, the lighthouse light moved. The giant beam slowly rotated away from the forest and stopped directly on Ethan. At that moment, every window in the lighthouse reflected someone standing behind him, hundreds of reflections. Ethan slowly turned around. Nothing. Only the empty room. But when he looked back at the window, the people in the forest were gone. And one new message had appeared on the fogged glass, written from the inside. The keeper must return. Ethan stepped backward. He had come to document a forgotten lighthouse, but now he understood something. The lighthouse wasn't abandoned. It was waiting. The next morning, Ethan planned to leave. He packed his equipment before sunrise. The ferry should arrive at 9 a.m. He just needed to reach the dock, but when he stepped outside, he stopped. The path to the dock was gone. Not blocked, not damaged, gone. Where the trail had been yesterday, there was only thick forest. Ethan checked his map. The dock should have been less than half a mile away, but the island looked different, almost like he was standing somewhere else. Then he heard something behind him. The lighthouse bell. One single ring. He slowly turned. The lighthouse light was still on, even in daylight, and from the top window, a figure was watching him. A man wearing an old lighthouse keeper's uniform. Thomas Reed. The man slowly raised his hand and pointed toward the tower, as if telling Ethan, "Come back." Ethan stood frozen outside the lighthouse. The morning sun had already risen above the horizon, yet the strange glow from the lighthouse remained. The light continued rotating, slowly, searching, like it was looking for something or someone. Ethan stared at the figure standing inside the top window, the old lighthouse keeper, Thomas Reed. For a moment, Ethan thought he was seeing things, but the figure didn't disappear. It simply watched him. Then the window became empty. The keeper was gone. Ethan grabbed his backpack and ran toward the place where the dock should have been. He pushed through the thick forest, following the map on his phone, but every path led him back to the same place, the lighthouse. No matter how far he walked, he always returned to the tower. After several hours, exhaustion began taking over. He sat beneath a tree and looked back at the lighthouse. That was when he noticed something strange. The lighthouse wasn't standing on the cliff anymore. It was closer, much closer, almost as if the entire building had moved through the forest. Ethan slowly stood up. The island was changing. That evening, Ethan returned to the lighthouse. Not because he wanted to, because he had no choice. Inside, everything looked different. The dusty rooms were gone. The broken furniture had disappeared. The lighthouse looked exactly as it had over 100 years ago. Oil lamps burned along the walls. Old maps covered the tables. And somewhere above, footsteps echoed. Someone was walking through the tower. Ethan followed the sound. When he reached the top, he found Thomas Reed standing beside the giant lens. This time, Ethan could see him clearly. The lighthouse keeper looked like a normal man, tired, afraid, lost. "Who are you?" Ethan asked. The man slowly turned. "I was the last keeper." "You're Thomas Reed." The old man's expression changed. "You know my name." Ethan held up the journal. "You wrote this." Thomas looked at the book, then looked toward the ocean. "I wrote many things, but nobody believed me." Ethan stepped closer. "What happened here?" Thomas remained silent for a moment. Then he answered, The light was never meant to guide ships. It was meant to guide them away. Ethan felt a chill. Guide what away? Thomas looked toward the dark waters. Something that comes when the lake is calm. Something that has been here longer than this island. The lighthouse bell suddenly rang. Thomas looked terrified. It's coming. The windows began shaking. The light started rotating faster. Outside, the forest became filled with hundreds of small glowing lights. The same figures had returned, but this time, they were not standing in the forest. They were walking toward the lighthouse. Thomas grabbed Ethan's arm. You must leave before the light chooses you. How? Thomas pointed toward the lens. The light brought you here. Only the light can send you back. Ethan looked at the enormous rotating lens. What does that mean? Thomas didn't answer. Instead, he stepped backward into the darkness. The lighthouse door opened by itself. Outside, the fog covered everything. But through the fog, Ethan saw a familiar sight, a dock, the ferry, a way home. He run. The moment he stepped outside, the lighthouse light focused directly on him. A blinding white beam surrounded his body. For a second, he heard hundreds of voices whispering, not from outside, from inside his own mind. The keeper must remain. Ethan fell to the ground. When he opened his eyes, he was standing at the dock. The ferry was waiting. The captain looked surprised. You're lucky. Ethan stared at him. What do you mean? The captain frowned. We haven't been able to reach this island for 3 days. Ethan's blood ran cold. 3 days. He looked back. The lighthouse stood silently on the cliff. The light was gone. Everything looked normal. Almost. He boarded the ferry without saying a word. As the boat moved away, Ethan watched the island disappear into the fog. For the first time in days, he felt safe. Weeks passed. Ethan returned home and tried to forget everything. He stopped making documentaries, stopped exploring abandoned places. He deleted all his footage from the lighthouse. Or at least, he thought he did. One night, while organizing old files on his computer, he found a video he didn't recognize. The file name was simple. The Next Keeper. Ethan opened it. The video showed the inside of the lighthouse. The camera angle was impossible. It was filming from the top of the tower, looking down at Ethan, standing beside the lens. But the recording wasn't from his visit. It was from the future. On the screen, Ethan watched himself slowly turn toward the camera. His face was pale. His eyes were empty. Then, future Ethan whispered, "The light doesn't choose where you go." A pause. Then, "It chooses what you become." The video ended. Ethan immediately shut the computer, but something caught his attention. A faint glow was coming from the hallway. He slowly walked out of his room. On the wall hung an old mirror, a mirror he had owned for years. But now, in the reflection, behind him, was the lighthouse, standing on the island. The light was shining, and at the top window, someone was watching. Ethan turned around. Nothing. He looked back at the mirror. The figure was closer, one step closer than before. Then the mirror fogged over. A sentence slowly appeared, written from the inside. The lighthouse always finds its keeper. Years later, sailors on Lake Superior still tell the same story. On certain nights, when the water becomes perfectly still, a distant lighthouse beam appears through the fog, a lighthouse that shouldn't exist. And if someone looks directly into that light, they say the lighthouse looks back, because some places are abandoned by people, but never by what lives there.